Welcome to News from Neptune for December 27th in the last week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who call themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a Ghost of an Anti-War Movement Past edition of News from Neptune, in support of opposition to U.S. wars and war provocations. I have in mind the ghost reproach to Hamlet. Do not forget, this visitation is but to whet thy almost blunted purpose. And whet there, of course, is W-H-E-T. We have a note from our friend Jeffrey Sinclair, editor of Counterpunch, today about a group that is also close to our hearts. He has an article entitled 20 Activist Groups That Are Making a Big Difference. He writes, "Are you frustrated with the resistance, copyright, the resistance, still fronting for the failures of Hillary Clinton, while thousands of kids whose families fled the killing regimes in Central America that she enabled are being held in concentration camps? You're not alone. Here at Counterpunch, we get lots of calls from readers this time of year asking, where are the good groups? Where can I send a year-end check and know that the money will be well spent, not recycle into a fat executive salary or an annoying direct mail campaign? There are many such groups out there. Indeed, there's a vibrant and thriving grassroots movement across a whole range of issues. Unfortunately, we can't bring all of them to your attention, but once or twice a year, we devote the pages of Counterpunch to a survey of what these organizations are up to. Here's our end-of-the-year list of good groups, the real resistance, fighting on the front lines against ICE, the coal companies, the police, the CIA, the warmongers, the pipeline gougers, the bankers, the slum lords, big pharma, and the child separators. They all deserve our support, and if you can spare it, your cash. They mentioned particularly a group close to our heart here, and that's Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago. Since Obama's election, the anti-war movement in the United States has withered away, even as the wars and interventions have expanded with rising body counts. Yet one group has never wavered. You'll find activists with Voices for Creative Nonviolence leading protests at the White House, blocking the entry to drone operational centers, occupying nuclear missile silos, educating inside U.S. prisons, and organizing for peace inside war zones from Afghanistan to Syria. Most crucially, Voices for Creative Nonviolence recognizes that war is waged by many means. Almost alone among U.S. anti-war groups, Voices for Creative Nonviolence is mounting a resistance to the economic war machine. And its chair, Kathy Kelly, is a friend of ours and one of the 10 people that keeps God from destroying the universe. So keep them in mind, and keep in mind the vestigial anti-war movement It's it's as necessary today as it was a generation ago, and far less in evidence because of the efforts that have been made in the last generation to suppress it. They've been largely successful. You might notice that amongst the Democratic candidates for president, there's only one who can be clearly called anti-war, and that's Tulsi Gabbard, and the others all managed to avoid that issue, even Bernie Sanders. What's on your mind, David? What's the top of your list?
Well, identity politics, as always, is on the top of my list, and I reviewed my notes for the shows that we've done this morning, and
you keep notes from the shows we've
done? Well,
I'm
not
impressed.
Notes, but the papers that I bring in to read from or refer to are still in Word documents, and I went back. I think we did about 35 shows this year, and I noticed the number of times we've spoken about identity politics or identity politics related issues, which is probably more my fault than your fault, but I think this is what we're dealing with here.
Yep.
I've been pretty preoccupied with as I've talked about on the show before, I've been pretty preoccupied with the New York Times 1619 project, the criticisms of that project, the criticisms of that project especially among those who call themselves Marxists. And it's overwhelming me with a certain kind of anger to see the manner in which this debate is being played out. Let me just begin by reading part of what the origin is of this particular form of black identity politics that we've referred to many times on the show, but maybe not in this context. That is the notion of Afro-pessimism, the fact that white people ain't never going to change. And this has been identified with a man named Frank Wilderson, and it has been most publicly identified with the much more well-known Ta-Nehisi Coates. Back in 2017, in May, on the Jacobin website, a guy named R.L. Stevens, who is associated with Adolph Reed in various ways, wrote the following about Afro-pessimism and about Frank Wilderson. Wilderson sees America as enacting two distinct dreams. For Wilderson, quote, the dream of black accumulation and death, unquote, is separate from, quote, the dream of worker exploitation, unquote. Ultimately, in both Coates's and Wilderson's respective frameworks, solidarity is unimaginable and class struggle is rendered futile. Though Coates does not go to the lengths Wilderson does to position himself in opposition to materialist politics, the result is effectively equivalent: a separation of race and class combined with the deep skepticism of class-based solidarity, reforms, or even revolution. And R.L. Stevens goes on, this is a turn away from the freedom tradition embodied by Fannie Lou Hamer, she of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who famously tried to be represented at the Democratic Party convention in 1964, back when they would televise things like that in real time. For her, the problem of racism wasn't cosmology or ontology. It was an expression of politics implicated in class antagonism. Class antagonism. Fannie Lou Hamer stood, quote unquote, with the masses, both white and black. Solidarity through struggle from below, including class struggle, formed her path to victory. That's from R.L. Stevens, Between the Black Body and Me, from Jacobin, May of, just the Jacobin blog, not the Jacobin magazine or quarterly, May of 2017. So we've been talking about these issues since then and a lot longer than since then, but they've really heated up this year. They're heating up locally, Carl, on the pages of our local newspaper, because people have got it in their idea that the school district needs to do something about the fact that only 4% of black students are considered adequate in terms of their math and reading, whereas 49% of white students are. The local NAACP and the ACLU and the representatives of those groups published a letter in the newspaper, as well as I think there was an article about these groups and their concerns. And there was a response, editorial response by the News Gazette editors, presumably Jim Dye, in this regard, which rightly questioned the approach of the ACLU and NAACP, but of course continued on more not with the theme of social class, but with implying the culture of poverty. The culture of poverty done it, but where does poverty come from? Poverty comes from social class. Poverty becomes from the manner in which the working class is exploited by the capitalist class. Here is my response to the letter written by the representative of the ACLU, Carol Spindell, who is known to me slightly, and a woman named Minnie Pearson, who represents the NAACP. This is my letter. And subsequent to all of the things that have been written since then about that. The debate in the News Gazette regarding racial disparities, quote unquote, in Unit 4 schools is remarkably uninformed, if not slanderous. Unsurprisingly, it occurs within the limits set by a society that quite intentionally promotes radical income and wealth inequality, not on merit, quote unquote, but systemic, legalized, and socially admired greed. In this context, those who call themselves liberal or progressive, quote unquote, and those who accept capitalism, imperialism, and war use weasel words: diversity, equity, equal opportunity, etc. They speak the obscurantist language of individual attitudes and systemic cultural or racial discrimination, quote unquote, rather than the revelatory language of systemic economic and environmental exploitation and its accompanying success, quote unquote, at materially, medically, and intellectually hammering working class families. Unit 4 teachers and administrators, some of whom I've voluntarily worked with in recent years, range from merely competent to excellent. The ACLU and NAACP, ironically evidencing limited analytical skills, look to race, quote unquote, like an inebriated person looks for keys under a streetlight. Nevertheless, corporate-driven, multicultural, quote unquote, curriculum and testing regimes are designed to certify the bright, quote unquote, futures of privileged students while preparing working class students, regardless of race, for a future of alienation, self-blame, disrespected labor, and financial struggle. If the latter students don't like that, the neoliberal corporate and political establishment makes it clear they can serve as military cannon fodder, medicate and entertain themselves, go to prison, or labor and suffer in silent desperation and false hope. Schools are at worst, bureaucratic accomplices in this rigged system. Liberal critics are oblivious to or enablers of those profiting from this rigging. I know that sounds a little harsh, but I really think that people are on the wrong track when they're looking to tweak the way schools work to deal with fundamental, either call them class issues, call them class race issues, but it isn't anything that teachers are doing or that schools are doing to children or not doing to children that is causing the disparities in these test scores, we could question, and I would question, the role of testing in the way education works, but it certainly does indicate that students are not academically prepared. The questions as to why that is the case, we cannot look to simply race or racial discrimination to understand these things. And it would be good if the NAACP and the ACLU, they can go on being liberals if they want. They can go on fighting for individual rights if they want. But this has nothing to do with the issues that they're trying to tackle when they write a letter like this or put forward a critique like this.
Thank you, David. The text David referred to, texts plural that David has referred to, will be placed on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. And we welcome your comments about anything we say here at News from Neptune. You can send them, lack of other places, you can send them to Carl, C-A-R-L, that's me, at newsfromneptune.com.
I would welcome anyone's comments on any of these issues, including Carol and Aaron Ammons, who are promoting the 1619 Project on their WEFT radio program and have been for quite some time. I would also welcome comments by our friends David Johnson and Gus Wood, who do the World Labor Hour, who I think are willing to tackle these issues and probably have in some way or other. I don't know if they've gotten to the 1619 issue. I don't know if they've discussed local education issues, but it seems to me there needs to be a little bit more honesty and forthrightness in debating the class-race issue instead of just talking past each other. I would welcome the comments of Sundiata Shajua, Professor Sundiata Shajua, who has a bi-weekly or so column in the News Gazette on Sundays in which he talks about race issues, but seems to only refer tangentially to class issues, and certainly doesn't seem, in my reading of him, to have questioned the manner in which this debate has been carried out, especially in the post-1619 context. This is an opportunity to clarify these things. Unfortunately, this academic community tends to be, the nature of the discourse tends to be controlled by the people that are associated with what Adolph Reed calls the black misleadership class. And they're not central to it, but I think that they sort of passively submit to the dictates of the black misleadership class, especially when they, for instance, continue to admire Barack Obama in the manner in which Carol Ammons does.
We'll put some relevant documents on this matter also on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, including some interesting recent analyses of the New York Times 1619 Project, which begins to look curiouser and curiouser, I think, as the discussion goes on.
Yes, it does.
So,
and look at the WSWS.org website, the World Socialist website, for the various critiques. They're adding them every few days these days. So
it's an important discussion, no question, and we will see if we can get some of those documents together, including the ones that we've talked about here.
They're all on one page. There's one master page on the WSWS website, so not hard to find.
Back to the anti-war question on News from Neptune. Howie Hawkins wrote a recent article in Counterpunch. Hawkins seeks to get the Green Party's nomination for 2020, and his Counterpunch article starts, quote, "Although it's a constant refrain from Democratic leaders and commentators, the Green Party is not why the Democrats lost to Bush and Trump. In trying to excuse her loss to Trump, Hillary Clinton recently made the baseless smears that Jill Stein, the Greens' 2016 presidential candidate, is a, quote, Russian asset." She really said that. "And that Russians and Republicans are grooming," her word, "a third-party challenger for 2020. Guess who? Tulsi Gabbard." This Counterpunch article goes no further to explain Hawkins' views on Russiagate, But we know he supported Russiagate lies, however inchoately. Here's what Hawkins told Primo Nutmeg about 6 months ago. Quote, MSNBC, CNN, Fox put that picture, that was a picture of Jill Stein in Russia, seated at a table with Vladimir Putin, Michael Flynn, and another person whose back is to the camera. I mean,
that was me, actually.
yeah, that would explain a lot.
Yeah.
Fox put that picture out there in a lot of print media, again and again and again. They're doing it for Russia propaganda. This is Howie Hawkins. That was what the Russians wanted. I mean, it's so ironic. So the media they're following the Russiagate thing, which I think is serious. Howie Hawkins thinking the Russiagate thing is serious. And I think Trump ought to be impeached. I think it's obvious he sought collusion. He did collude, him and his son and his, son-in-law. I know it's all over that first volume of the Mueller report. It's all over there. I mean, when people say it showed no collusion, no, it didn't. Mueller says right away, I didn't talk about collusion. They're talking about the legal definition of conspiracy. Plus, I can't indict a president according to this OLC letter in the Justice Department. He just laid out the evidence for a prosecutor to be appointed by Congress. And I think that's all serious. Now, this is what we're getting from the Green Party, the supposed Russian asset. So things are embarrassing. Strangely enough, Jimmy Dore, whose programs on YouTube are, I think, getting better and better. Jimmy Dore and Jill Stein both strongly disagree with Hawkins' position on Russiagate. Stein also said that Hawkins has pulled back his support for Russiagate. She, as a Green Party nominee for president, was appalled by Howie Hawkins speaking up for the Russiagate nonsense, as she was appalled by Hillary Clinton's notion that Clinton's loss was her fault, Jill Stein's fault. Primo Nutmeg, an interesting site, interviewed Dore and Stein in separate interviews and played the same clip of Hawkins, the one that I just quoted, to each of them in order to get their reactions. The following are excerpts from their reactions. Jimmy Dore, the newscaster, says, so Howie Hawkins pushing Russiagate as a Green Party person, the guy is intellectually impaired. That's Dore's analysis.
He doesn't mince any words,
exactly,
but at least that doesn't include his most pointed Anglo-Saxonism.
We have to be careful about quoting Jimmy Dore, yes, but but he's frequently right, even if embarrassingly expressed. I don't know what his emotional development is, says Jimmy Dore, talking about Hawkins, but when he does something like that, that is a guy not to be trusted. You can't trust Howie Hawkins as far as you can throw him. That guy, is he a mole inside the Green Party? Probably. Once you begin the conspiracist thinking, it's hard to know where to stop. So now this explains Howie Hawkins, who has been a Green fixture for a long time. Jimmy Dore continues, the Green Party needs to get rid of guys like Howie Hawkins who push Russiagate. And if they embrace him, that's the end of the Green Party for sure. Jill Stein was on my show, says Jimmy Dore, and she also castigated Howie Hawkins for doing that. And Howie Hawkins reveals himself to be deficient and not up to the task of leading anybody anywhere to do anything. What he did was cowardly and stupid and destructive, and he's toxic. If he's the Green Party nominee, then good luck. Now, and this is the place in which we were supposed to get anti-war possibilities in the next election. Jill Stein said, so I've talked to Howie about this at great length. Actually, I owe him a briefing paper because it makes me very sad that people in the Green Party who should know better are very vulnerable to this kind of warmongering and propaganda. That's quite an admission from Jill Stein. And it takes some degree of information and skepticism to be able to reject this stuff. It should not be taken at face value. when James Clapper says to Congress that we, that is the NSA, are not and never have been surveying the American public, or when all the security agencies are raving about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, how many times do you have to go through this? Or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that initiated the war in Vietnam. Sidelight there. How many of these things do you have to go through before you start not taking statements of our security agencies at face value? They may be right, but they may be wrong, and you really need to look at corroborating evidence. And unfortunately, there's been such a media orgy around Mueller, around Russiagate, around all the hysteria that gets blown way out of proportion, and they never publish the retractions when the stories turn out to be fake. To my mind, it's very sad when people who should know better are falling for this stuff. That's Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee for president last time round, and the dismay that the enthusiasm for Russiagate within the Green Party causes even her, causes her, and the possibility that the Green Party's anti-war stance will be compromised substantially by this. Primo Nutmeg continued the interview with Jill Stein by saying, "What did Hallie say about it when you talked to him?" And Stein said he pulled back a bit, quite a bit, and said that he really looked forward to that discussion. "I had to dig deep because I was being accused. I knew right away that the Steele report was a bunch of nonsense because it had lies about me. It said that my trip to Russia was paid for by Russia, and that was part of how they co-opted me, and that's part of how they engaged me. The Steele report said that Russia's strategy was to engage people like me, even third parties, and that it was successful in doing things like sponsoring my trip to Russia. And I knew that was full of lies. So if it was lying about me, what else was it lying about? So I was not inclined whatsoever to take it at face value or the intelligence agency's report. And it really distressed me that people who know me and were informed about our campaign could see that and not just presume that this fear campaign is nonsense." Close quote. That's Jill Stein on the suggestion that the Russiagate stuff should be taken seriously, that has infected the Green Party as well, and the last public display of anti-war enthusiasm is compromised once again by this sort of nonsense about Russia. It's unfortunate, but as we head into the presidential campaign, the notion that there will be much anti-war sentiment expressed is been handily taken care of by the political establishment.
Yeah, I guess off the cuff I would say here that I'm a pessimist when it comes to third-party movements in this country. Not that they haven't had an effect historically, which they did in the late, before the Civil War, in the late 1800s, and to a certain extent even after World War II. But the only way I think that they could be successful, given the obstacles, would be to appropriate major party candidates. That would be the only way to give them the profile. So I would suggest that if both Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard find themselves not nominated for president of this country by the Democratic Party, that they become, in whatever order they choose, the presidential and vice presidential candidates for the Green Party. Then I think you might energize the 20 to 30% of the people who would automatically vote for them, regardless of all the pressure, all the Trump versus let's say, Warren pressure, or all the pressure to vote for Warren or Buttigieg or whomever. I think we're probably ready for that. I prefer that we be ready to nominate Bernie Sanders to lead the Democratic Party, and that he choose Tulsi Gabbard. I'm only saying that because of the polling numbers, not for any prejudice against Tulsi Gabbard, obviously.
It's unfortunate the extent to which the anti-war line has been excluded from the discussion. It strangely crops up with the sitting president. It's Donald Trump who keeps saying we should withdraw the troops from Syria, we should withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, and then is immediately contradicted by his administration, by the Pentagon, by the State Department, and by those who are committed to the neoconservative policies of the Bush and Obama administrations. This is an internal fight going on within the American administration, and the erratic nature of the commander-in-chief is such that we don't have a real discussion of any of this at all. And when the discussion does threaten to occur, the so-called deep state, the political establishment, strikes back immediately. Look,
Why is it a fight? Why is it a fight? He's president.
Yeah, well,
it wasn't a fight when he ran for the Republican nomination. That he didn't fight. He just told Jeb Bush and everyone else that they were full of crap, and he won. Why, now that he's president and he has all this power, who does he have to fight? All he has to do is tell people what he wants.
It's not quite that easy, I think.
know it's not quite that easy, but it needs to be said.
Yes, it does. It should be said, and we should have a real discussion on these matters rather than the fake discussion that has occurred all along about how Trump is inadequate as a head of state, head of government. I mean, the example of Afghanistan was brought to the fore by the publication by, of all people, the Washington Post, of a series of documents that have been compared to the Pentagon Papers about about America's involvement in Vietnam. These accounts of the horrors of American decision-making in regard to killing people in Afghanistan, which we've been doing for almost 20 years. We've been doing it for a good bit longer than that, as a matter of fact. But as an open case of warfare, it's been all of the current century. In response to the things that Trump says, the Pentagon has found it necessary, Trump says, and to these revelations published in the Washington Post, the Pentagon finds it necessary to defend its war. It's a dirty little war, but the only war we've got, as some of the proponents of the Vietnam War long ago used to say. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley and Defense Secretary Mark Esper spoke during a news conference at the Pentagon last Friday, and they denied that the officials had lied to the American public about the 18-year conflict in Afghanistan. That was the burden of the materials published by the Washington Post. These were materials put together by the establishment, by the Pentagon and the State Department, and they included the assertion that these organizations themselves had been lying to the American people about the war from the beginning. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, defended the 18-year war in Afghanistan, pushing back bluntly on the central conclusion of the recently published official study into the war that showed officials presented a much rosier public assessment of the conflict than was evident on the ground, and insisting that the war has achieved its central objective. What is the central objective of the Afghanistan war? Do you remember? Quote, to prevent another 9/11 style attack on the U.S. homeland. That's why we're killing Afghans. May not be too clear, huh? Those with long memories may recall Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, saying that what the U.S. was doing was gathering up the most fanatic Muslim fighters it could find, who eventually would be called jihadists, and sending them into Afghanistan. This is during the Carter administration, quote, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own. That was the original point. Like all of American foreign policy, it's ordered to opposition to what Brzezinski himself called peer competitors in Eurasia, that is Russia and China. So the Afghanistan war had very little to do with what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says now, that is stopping another 9/11. It had a great deal to do with war provocations against Russia and war in Eurasia, which has been the basis of American foreign policy in the region for generations. Some would say it goes back to the open door policy of the 19th century. The remarks from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff amounted to one of the most direct rebuttals of the controversial papers, that is, the things published by about Afghanistan by the Washington Post, since their publication, or obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. The study found that U.S. officials repeatedly and emphatically acknowledged a lack of understanding of both the strategy and status of the war. They literally said, we don't know what we're doing. This is what the Pentagon, or what the brass were saying. Government interviewers spoke to more than 400 officials who played a direct role in the war, who offered blunt retrospectives, believing that their assessments would remain confidential. This is all an internal report, in that sense, like the Pentagon paper. Quote, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. Close quote. That's from Douglas Lute, a 3-star Army general and the White House's Afghan war czar during both the Bush and Obama administrations, speaking in 1904. Speaking in 2015. Quote, what are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. Close quote. That's the assessment of the man who was in charge of the war, of the longest war in American history, in the Bush and Obama administrations. These are not outsiders. These are not, quote, whistleblowers, close quote. These were the people who were killing Afghans in great numbers. And they said, we didn't know what we were doing. That was our job.
Just a note for those who may be under the age of, say, 40, who might randomly be watching this show, the Pentagon Papers refers to the Vietnam War. The papers released by Daniel Ellsberg, who was a whistleblower,
yes,
in the early 1970s.
The release was the work of a whistleblower, not the papers.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah.
That's very true. One of the most interesting commentators on these matters today is an ex-Army officer called Danny Surgeon, and I'll put his most recent article comparing the Washington Post Freedom of Information Act revelations with the Pentagon Papers, and the similarities and differences become clear. Shall I go on with this, or do you want to?
I have some stuff, but
okay,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'll come back to this. Unfortunately, it's not going away.
Just a note: we've talked about the election in the UK, and we probably beat that into the ground a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago.
Certainly deserves to be beaten into the ground.
And I've listened to quite a few podcasts and programs which have been generally very good at analyzing what the nature is that the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn found themselves in leading up to that vote. But as I was looking through my notes from earlier in the year, I came across this by a man named Kostas Lapavitsas, who, as you can tell by his name, is a Greek person who actually teaches in London and who is a Marxist and who actually came to my attention back when the Real News Network used to actually be the Real News Network. I don't think it any longer is.
I'm afraid not.
But what Kostas Slapovisis said way back in March, as a kind of foreshadowing of what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, is this. Corbyn is trapped in what I mentioned to you. Corbyn's going to have an equation to solve in the Labour Party, which is impossible practically to solve. He's been navigating a minefield. It's obvious that Corbyn doesn't really, he would prefer a kind of Brexit, but his party doesn't. And he's got a terrible problem because every time he attempts to put these ideas across, his MPs, members of parliament, rebel. And he's got problems from his party membership, which is actually more and more, has become more and more pro-Europe. They've created a complete fantasy of what Europe is, and they've latched themselves onto that. And this is a way of saying that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party and the campaign he conducted and the line that he took, the kind of "we'll have another vote on Brexit" line, was cutting the baby in half, and it didn't work, because by doing that he lost the working class, what's often referred to as the 70s Labour Party, the genuinely more social democratic or socialist Labour Party, the Labour Party of Tony Benn, his mentor. He lost that vote in the north and northeast of England, and therefore the Labour Party has been sort of mortally wounded in its current form. There are many complications to this, but because Jeremy Corbyn didn't take a proactive stand on Brexit, saying, there's a bad way to do this, but there's a good way to do this, and cast his lot with that point of view, he lost some of the sort of liberal pro-Brexit people, and he lost the working class anti-Brexit people who now live, those who live in what is the British Rust Belt, in the northern part of England. So that's that for the Corbyn debacle.
It's been said that the 2019 general election, the recent general election in the UK, will go down as the moment in which British voters, in effect, voted a resounding yes in a de facto second referendum on Brexit. The referendum on Brexit that started this whole thing was a question of Britain leaving the economic embrace of the European Union, which it had joined years ago. The British public voted leave, and the argument since then in Britain has been about how to do it, and the Labour Party disastrously avoided a clear position on this matter. Seems clear that the that Brexit made the difference between Labour's moderate success in the 2017 general election and the election held this month in Britain, in which Labour was destroyed. One Labour activist put it this way, quote, "In 2017, Corbyn was our leader. Our manifesto," the party platform, "our manifesto was radical. Our position on Brexit was to respect the referendum. In 2019, Corbyn was our leader. Our manifesto was radical. Our position on Brexit was to have a second referendum." Can we get a bit real about this? What changed? Why the disaster in 2019 follow on the moderate success in 2017? The difference is clear. And I think we can take perhaps a further step in this direction and draw a parallel between Trump's electoral successes and Boris Johnson's. Not only do they look alike, but they also inspire the same views in voters.
Don't make me think about what they look like.
Trump was elected by 2012 Obama voters, people who had voted for Obama in 2012, who stayed home or didn't vote for Obama's successor, that is Clinton. in 2016. They no longer believed in hope and change. That caused 6 states that had gone for Obama in 2012, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, to desert his successor, to desert Mrs. Clinton, and flip to Trump in 2016. Voters in the most recent elections in the US and UK rejected their situation under neoliberal policies directed from Brussels or Washington. This can be seen as a populist protest. Populism has been called an ideology that pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. Close quote. That may be a mistake, a misapprehension, but that's the notion that drove both the election of Trump and the election of the Conservatives to a 5-year term in the British Parliament. Also, it's worth saying, I think, that there is a slightly different dimension to this that some people who read the high-price press don't always notice. Voters in both the U.S. and the U.K. Resented the attempt to ignore or reverse their choice by Russiagate in the U.S. And the impeachment drive. People are amazed that the impeachment drive has actually led to an increase of support for Donald Trump. And by not instituting Brexit in the UK, these are democratic responses, in a way, of people who say, look, this is what we voted for, and the political establishment is not allowing it to happen. What's going on here? What happened to our notion of democracy? I think more Americans and more Brits think that than we admit.
I've got to say, I don't want to go too much into this, but did you read that ridiculous letter by Ed Collaget this morning?
I did,
in
unfortunately.
The news? Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, what a piece of work. I don't think he's written some bad stuff, but nothing ever that bad. We're being ruled by minority. Yeah. In this country, it's the wealthy minority, Ed, not just the people who voted for Trump. For crying out loud.
Collaget is a retired professor of what we used to call government at the local university, and is known for off-the-wall opinions that are hardly worth refuting, and I think he's done it again.
Yeah. Let me read, since I haven't offended, a feminist for a while on this program. Let me close the year or let me read this. This was from earlier this year by a reliable counterpunch commentator, Rob Urey. It was written last March. I'm sorry, Jeff, I didn't write down the title, but I'm sure you can find it. He had a graph up, and the caption to the graph was this: between 1953 and 1974, the gold part of the golden age, inflation-adjusted family income with 1.25 workers per family rose 70% in 20 years. From 1975 through 2017, that's over 40 years, with 1.65, not 1.25, but 1.65 workers per family, and over twice as many years, it rose 33%, half of of the 70% it had risen in half the time. He goes on, and then the caption to the graph goes on: given that women contributed fully to family production through largely unpaid labor prior to entering the paid workforce, the last 4 decades have been an utter catastrophe for working families, despite gains in gender pay equity. Source: the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Urey goes on. The capitalist coup of the 1970s was undertaken to shift power away from labor and to the rich so they could claim a larger share of labor's product. And the rich were successful. Labor productivity continued to rise, graph below, as women re-entered the workforce. But the capitalist class and corporate executives were able to keep all this increase for themselves. From the capitalist perspective, it was women's class position and relative pay levels that made them attractive employees, not their gender. The distinction is crucial. The contemporary argument over class reductionism, the contention that issues of race, gender, and identity aren't fully encompassed and therefore can't be fully addressed through class struggle, is anti-political, meaning anti actually doing something to change the society. The struggle over gender pay equity, which is just and right within the liberal frame in which it was developed, was largely irrelevant to the distribution of income and wealth that affected the broader economic interests of its working class proponents. Liberation in the form of struggle to achieve localized equity, there's that equity word that's always being used by liberals, within capitalist political economy was used to facilitate the concentration of political and economic power by an oligarchy that views power outside its reach only in relation to its own interests. I'm not, of course, saying that women shouldn't be in the workforce. I'm not saying they shouldn't have equal pay. It's just that I'm not saying go back to the 1950s and stay home. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I am saying that these fundamental issues of class warfare have to be dealt with in a whole different frame. And Rob Urey is saying have to be dealt in a whole different framework than the very limited framework in which we are confronted with when we talk about pay equity within vocational categories for women.
A woman in the UK, Maya Forstater, was fired from her job as a tax researcher after she tweeted against the government's Gender Recognition Act. That is, she criticized it. She said it's not a good idea, which allowed people to legally change their gender. Legally, that is, in terms of government documents. The woman's tweets were deemed transphobic, and she was fired for holding this opinion. In a tweet about the matter, J.K. Rowling writes that forcing, quote, women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real is unfair, and even uses the hashtag I stand with Maya. J.K. Rowling, we're talking about the author of the Harry Potter books.
That's for people over 60.
That's right. Everybody else knows who she is. Americans call her Rowling, but in fact her name is Rowling. But in any case,
thanks for clarifying that.
she wrote,
when falsely informed.
I quote J.K. Rowling, "Dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who will have you, live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real? Question mark. I stand with Maya." Well, the storm has been remarkable on the internet, both in Britain and the U.S., and J.K. Rowling is now dignified with the term TERF. It seems to me that
trans-exclusionary radical feminist.
And it seems to me that she's absolutely right in standing up for this woman who was fired for holding the opinion that, quote, sex is real. You've been watching.
And we've still got, 5 minutes left? 5 minutes.
Okay, go ahead. You've got to follow up.
Well, I don't have anything more to read, which hopefully the listener will be thankful for. But let me just say that the relationship of all of these identity politics avoidant issues, whether they have to do with trans issues, I think the sort of immigrant related issues that I've been talking about in recent weeks on this program very much have to do with the realm of identity politics as it's been played out in this class context. I think that the more I watch the Thomas Garza prattle on his program, on his immigration program that's on UPTV, the more I hear him prattle on about those people that he doesn't like, that he thinks all vote for Donald Trump because they are bigots, the more I realize that identity politics is pervasive in all of these areas, that there doesn't seem to be any way for people to delve into these areas. Whatever worthy causes there doesn't seem to be any way for people to delve into these areas without their political stance basically being limited and appropriated or co-opted by neoliberal politics. So the left, such as it is really in a real pickle at this point in time in dealing with how to move forward and speak to various groups in a kind of a class-based and an anti-exploitation-based language, and we're not going to get any help from anybody I can see around here, except maybe our friends David Johnson and his colleague Gus Wood, and a few other genuinely anti-war people. I'm just not seeing it.
And in the larger picture, we have to realize that identity politics took its rise more than 40 years ago in the U.S. when American liberals abandoned class and exploitation as their primary concern, which was the case going back to the New Deal. Giving that up in the 1970s meant that liberals looked around for some other good cause to animate their politics, and they found discrimination. Discrimination, first of all, against blacks, but then discrimination for ever expanding groups of those discriminated against, some of which were not even recognized as identifiable groups in the 1970s. But that's what we've looked at for 40 years, and what seemed at first a peculiar road has become a way in which to eliminate, erase class politics, and that's the real problem, and that's what we should be talking about.
What Cedric Johnson at University of Illinois Chicago said in an article in Jacobin this year called "What Black Life Actually Looks Like." Just the first sentence of this article, first two sentences. For too long, the left has organized based on caricatures of black political life. If it wants to win, that is the left, it needs to start recognizing the role of class in black America.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the last week of 2019, a Ghost of an Anti-War Movement Past edition, in support of opposition to U.S. wars and war provocations, especially those against Russia and China. I have in mind the ghost reproach to Hamlet. Ghost, do not forget, this visitation is but to whet thy almost blunted purpose. Indeed. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Leggett and Kevin Lau. See the research notes on the Facebook page from News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.
And Happy New Year.